The late May air in Orange County is mild, with parking lot lights humming over warm pavement. In the Dorothy Jane Scott case, that ordinary quiet is where the file begins to gather weight. She was a 32-year-old mother, a secretary, and someone people described through steady, everyday details. Before the night she disappeared, there had already been phone calls from a man no one could name. The calls were strange enough to be remembered, but not solid enough to become evidence. So you begin where investigators had to begin, with routines, statements, and the careful order of a work night. A hospital errand, a car brought around to the entrance, and then an empty space where certainty should have been. Years later, the case would still depend on fragments that felt close, but never quite complete. A voice, a burned car, a delayed discovery, and a family waiting beside a telephone. And as we turn the first page, the question is not only what happened, but why the answer kept slipping out of reach. The first concrete shape in the file is not a street corner or a suspect's name, but a pattern of calls. Dorothy Jane Scott had been receiving them for months before the 28th of May, 1980. The man on the other end seemed to know where she had been, and sometimes where she was going. That detail mattered because it moved the calls out of the ordinary world of nuisance and into something more personal. He was not just speaking into the dark, he appeared to be watching or listening or gathering enough small facts to sound close. Dorothy lived in Stanton, California, and worked as a secretary at a shop in the area, often identified in reports as Swinger's Psych Shop. She was 32 years old, a single mother, and she was known as careful with her time. Her young son was the center of her days, and work was the practical frame around that responsibility. The people who remembered her often described steadiness first. She was not a person who drifted through life without people noticing. She had family near her, co-workers who knew her routines, and a set of ordinary obligations that kept her moving between home, work, and errands. That's one reason the calls stood out. They entered a life that had order. At first, the caller's words were described as strange, even intimate. He reportedly spoke as if he cared for her, as if he had chosen her in his mind. Then, at other times, the tone shifted. The affection became threatening, and the threat became hard to place because it arrived only as a voice. No face, no confirmed address, no object left behind that could easily be tested, tied, or catalogued. You can imagine the difficulty if you're sitting with the file under a lamp. A person says, "Someone is calling me." A person says, "He knows things." A person says, "I'm afraid." And you believe her, but the file still asks for something it can hold. A phone number, a recording, a witness, a name. In 1980, there was no caller identification waiting on a little screen beside the bed. There was no simple household device that quietly saved each incoming number. A trace could sometimes be arranged, but it took planning, time, and the cooperation of telephone systems that were slower than a frightened caller's hand. So the first decision point belongs to Dorothy herself. She had to decide whether to shrink her life around the calls or continue doing the things that needed to be done. She told people close to her. She stayed alert. She adjusted in ways that made sense. But she still went to work, still cared for her son, and still moved through the plain duties of a weekday. That is often how danger is remembered afterward, not as a constant siren, but as something folded into errands. It sits beside the grocery list. It waits near the time clock. It follows someone through the ordinary halls of a workplace. In the spring of 1980, Dorothy's co-workers were part of that ordinary world. They knew her not as a headline, but as the person at the desk, the person who helped, the person who stayed after a meeting when someone else needed care. On the evening of the 28th of May, there was a work meeting in Stanton. Among the people present were Dorothy, a co-worker named Pamela Head, and another co-worker, Conrad Bostron. At some point that night, Bostron began to feel unwell. Reports have often said he was suffering from symptoms connected to a spider bite, sometimes identified as a black widow bite. Whatever the exact medical wording, the concern was enough that Dorothy and Pamela helped take him to the hospital. The destination was the University of California Irvine Medical Center in Orange. That choice becomes important because it placed Dorothy away from her usual path, at a late hour, in a setting full of light, pavement, doors, and waiting. Hospitals at night have their own quiet rhythm. People sit in chairs under pale lights. Vending machines hum. Nurses walk quickly but not loudly. Friends wait with coats across their arms, checking the time, listening for a name to be called. Dorothy was there for someone else. That detail matters. She did not go to the hospital because of her own emergency. She went because a coworker needed help, and because she was the sort of person who did not easily leave another person alone. The visit took time. There were forms, treatment, waiting, and the slow pace that comes whenever a small crisis passes through a busy medical place. By the time Bostrom was ready to leave, the night had deepened. Dorothy then made a simple, practical decision. She would go and bring her car round to the hospital entrance, so the others would not have to walk far. It was a small kindness. It was also the last ordinary action that witnesses could clearly place. If you are reviewing the case, this is where you slow down. You do not rush past the parking lot. You let the scene remain still for a moment. Dorothy walks away from the entrance. Pamela and Conrad wait near the doors. The expectation is plain. A car will pull up, a door will open, everyone will go home. Instead, witnesses later described seeing Dorothy's car pass by quickly. It did not stop at the entrance. The people waiting could not clearly see who was behind the wheel. That uncertainty became one of the file's most stubborn facts. The car was there, Dorothy was not seen returning. The movement of the vehicle suggested that something had changed in the short distance between the parking area and the hospital doors. Not a long distance. Not an obscure mountain road, just the short distance that separates a parked car from the place where friends are waiting. Because the car did not stop, Pamela Head and Conrad Bostrom were left with confusion first. Confusion often arrives before fear. A person may think, perhaps she missed the entrance, perhaps she had to circle, perhaps something ordinary has delayed her. So they waited. Then they looked. Then they understood that the simple plan had not completed itself. That sequence is important because it shows how a missing person case often begins as a question of minutes. 1 minute late, 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. Then the mind starts measuring the silence differently. The hospital area was checked. People tried to account for where she could have gone. When Dorothy did not return, the earlier phone calls began to cast a longer shadow over the night. What had been troubling before now seemed connected to a real absence. That is a hard shift for any investigator. Before a disappearance, anonymous calls can be frightening but slippery. After a disappearance, the same calls become a possible map. They suggest that someone had been preparing, watching, or waiting for an opening. Authorities were contacted, and the first working task was to reconstruct the night without adding more than the facts allowed. Dorothy had been at work. She had gone to the hospital with co-workers. She had gone alone to retrieve her car. The car had been seen moving past the entrance. She had not returned. Those statements are plain, but they carry the weight of the whole early investigation. From there, investigators had to decide where to place their attention. They could focus on the hospital parking lot, where the change seemed to have happened. They could focus on Dorothy's personal life, because the caller appeared to know her. They could focus on the car, because it was the object that had moved away from the last known point. In a perfect case, those paths converge quickly. In Dorothy's case, each path seemed to open into another unanswered space. The next concrete development came away from the hospital. Dorothy's car was found in Santa Ana, in an alley, burning. The location mattered because it separated the vehicle from the medical center and widened the geography of the case. Now there was the hospital in Orange. There was the alley in Santa Ana. There was Dorothy's home and work life in Stanton. There were the calls that may have come from anywhere. The burning of the car also changed what investigators could hope to learn from it. A car can hold fingerprints, fibers, impressions, receipts, and small accidental traces, but fire is a great reducer of detail. It can remove the quiet marks that patient investigators need. So the recovered car gave the case a direction, while also taking away possibilities. That is one reason the case began to grow cold so early. There were facts, but some of the facts had been damaged. There were witnesses, but they could not name a driver. There had been warnings, but they had arrived as a voice without a body. The search for Dorothy began with urgency, but the investigation still had to move carefully. There is a difference between speed and certainty. Police could move quickly from place to place, but certainty did not move with them. They checked what could be checked. They spoke to co-workers. They reviewed the hospital visit. They tried to understand who knew Dorothy's schedule, who knew she had gone to the medical center, and who could have reached her in that small window of time. Cause and effect kept bringing them back to the same narrow place, because the caller seemed to know Dorothy. The people around her had to be considered. Because her car left the hospital without stopping, someone may have gained access at or near the parking lot. Because the car was later found burning, someone had reason to move it and remove what it might reveal. Each conclusion was reasonable. None was enough. The case file in those first days would have had the texture of lists, names, times, distances, statements, places to revisit, calls to return, questions to ask twice, because a second answer sometimes holds one small new word. This is the patient part of detective work that does not always fit into a short retelling. A detective does not only chase, a detective compares. A detective waits for a lab result, or a phone record, or a witness to remember that something was not quite as they first described it. A detective learns the shape of someone's ordinary life because the break in that life may be the only clue. Dorothy's ordinary life was examined with that kind of care. Her family was asked about her habits. Co-workers were asked about the meeting, the hospital, and the calls. Friends were asked whether she had mentioned a man, a fear, a strange encounter, or a repeated unwanted voice. The answers gave concern, but not a name. And without a name, the voice remained suspended over the file. Local attention soon followed, as it often does when a missing woman is still unaccounted for, and the details are both specific and incomplete. The Orange County Register reported on Dorothy's disappearance. A newspaper article can help a case. It can bring witnesses forward. It can remind someone that they saw a car, a person, a small movement in the corner of a night. But public attention can also invite someone who wants to shape the story. After coverage appeared, an anonymous man called the newspaper. He claimed responsibility for Dorothy's disappearance. The call could not be dismissed as ordinary cruelty, because the caller seemed to know details connected to the hospital errand. One of the details often associated with that call concerned Conrad Bostron's medical issue that night. That detail was not the kind of thing every casual reader would necessarily know. So investigators had to consider the possibility that the man on the phone was the same man who had called Dorothy before, or at least someone close enough to know more than the public should know. This is where the case becomes especially difficult. A caller who knows private details can be important, but a caller who speaks after newspaper coverage also stands inside a cloud of uncertainty. What did he truly know? What had he read? What had he heard from someone else? What could he guess? What was withheld? And what had already traveled quietly through workplaces, families, and neighbors? Investigators had to weigh the call without letting it carry more than it could bear. They treated it as significant. They compared it to the earlier harassment. They looked at the pattern of tone, timing, and knowledge. But still, the voice did not become a person. It did not step into a room. It did not leave a signature that could be matched. It came through a line, said what it chose to say, and disappeared again. For Dorothy's family, the public call must have felt like a new kind of injury. Not only was Dorothy missing, but someone was using the absence to speak. Someone was placing himself near the center of the story. Someone was deciding when others would hear from him. In a quiet investigation, that matters, because control can be a clue. A person who calls repeatedly may be seeking fear, attention, or the feeling of being unseen while still being present. But motive is not evidence by itself. Behavior can suggest a shape, but a court needs more than shape. A family needs truth, but investigators must prove a path. So the public appeal brought both help and complication. It widened the number of people who knew Dorothy's name. It may have encouraged some to speak. It may also have given the caller a stage. From that point forward, every call had to be heard in two ways. It might contain real knowledge. It might contain performance. It might be the offender. It might be someone imitating him. So investigators had to build a habit around uncertainty. They had to listen for what a caller knew, and also for what he wanted people to believe. A newspaper call is not the same as a private call to a home. It reaches outward, it places the voice in public, it changes the case from something held by a family and a police department into something the community starts to carry. That can be useful, and it can be unsteady. Someone reading the Orange County Register might remember seeing Dorothy's car. Someone might remember a man near the hospital. Someone might remember a voice, a remark, a co-worker, or an uneasy moment from weeks before. But the same article can also teach strangers the language of the case. It can give a caller details to repeat. It can give someone with no true knowledge a way to sound close. This is why detectives often hold back certain facts. They need a private measure. They need something only the right person would know. In Dorothy's case, the man who called the newspaper seemed to step too near that private line. He reportedly mentioned the hospital visit, and the reason Conrad Bostron had needed care. That kind of detail mattered. It suggested that the caller had either been there, had spoken with someone who was there, or had access to a circle where those facts were known. Each possibility opened a different path. If he had been at the hospital, then the parking lot became even more important. If he had spoken with someone from work, then the workplace network needed another careful reading. If he had learned the detail from gossip, then the case had already begun to leak into ordinary conversation. None of those paths could be ignored. None was simple. You can picture the investigators with a list of names on a desk: co-workers, friends, neighbors, people who had called Dorothy, people Dorothy had mentioned, people who had shown interest in her, people who may have known where she worked, when she worked, and how to reach her by phone. A list like that does not solve a case by itself. It only gives the search a beginning. Every name has to be checked without assuming guilt. Every statement has to be compared with time, place, and opportunity. And every small inconsistency has to be held gently, because memory is not a machine. People forget. People simplify. People remember the feeling of a night more clearly than the exact minute. The early days after Dorothy vanished were filled with that kind of sorting. Investigators had to ask ordinary questions in an extraordinary situation. Who last saw her at work? Who knew she was going to the hospital? Who could have followed her there? Who could have reached her car before she did? Who had access to a phone and the confidence to use it? That last question would grow larger as time passed, because after the newspaper call, the voice did not disappear from the family's life. It returned. Dorothy's parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, were left waiting in a way no parent should have to wait. Their daughter was gone, and there was no confirmed answer. Their grandson still needed care. The house still had meals, laundry, clocks, and small routines. But the telephone had become something different. It was no longer just a household object. It had become a point of contact with the unknown. A ring could mean a relative. A ring could mean a detective. A ring could mean someone offering help. And a ring could mean the man whose voice had already entered the case. Reports over the years have described repeated calls to the Scott family home after Dorothy disappeared. The caller would ask about Dorothy. Sometimes he would say things that suggested knowledge. Sometimes he would make claims that were painful and disturbing, and the family had to endure them while hoping the call might lead somewhere. The words themselves were important to investigators, but the pattern mattered too. A repeated caller is creating a rhythm. He chooses when to reach out. He chooses how long to stay on the line. He chooses whether to speak plainly or to hide behind short phrases and sudden silence. In the Scott home, each call carried a question. Could this be the call that finally reveals him? Could this be the call long enough to trace? Could this be the moment when the voice becomes a location? In 1980, tracing a call was not quick in the way many people might imagine now. There was no instant display on the family phone. There was no simple list of incoming numbers waiting to be printed. A trace often required coordination with the telephone company, and it required time. The caller had to stay on the line long enough for the system to work. That was the hard part. The man seemed to understand the value of brevity. He would speak, and then he would hang up. The family and police needed seconds to become minutes. The caller gave them seconds. This created one of the most painful technical limits in the case. The evidence was arriving in real time, but it was vanishing before it could be captured. If you are the detective reviewing this file, you start to feel the frustration in a quiet, practical way. You are not lacking effort, You are lacking a bridge. The family is cooperating. The police are listening. The telephone company may be ready. But the voice knows how to come and go before the net closes. That is the patient side of a cold case before it becomes cold. The waiting begins while the investigation is still warm. People wait by the phone. They wait for a trace. They wait for someone to make a mistake. They wait for one call to last just a little longer than the last. For Vera Scott, the calls were not only investigative events, they were personal interruptions into grief and uncertainty. A mother answering her own home phone should be allowed to hear a familiar voice. Instead, she had to be ready for a stranger. She had to listen carefully when every instinct may have wanted to hang up. She had to keep him talking, if she could. She had to remember tone, words, pauses, background noise, anything that might matter. That kind of listening asks a great deal of a person. It asks them to be both a parent and a witness. It asks them to feel pain and still notice details. Detectives understood that the calls might be the best available path to the person behind Dorothy's disappearance, so the family's telephone became part of the investigation. Arrangements were reportedly made to monitor and trace calls. The plan was simple in purpose, but difficult in practice. When the man called, the family would try to keep him talking. The longer he stayed, the better the chance of learning where the call came from, but the caller rarely offered that chance. He would not remain long enough. He seemed careful. And because he was careful, the evidence stayed incomplete. There is a particular kind of silence after a call like that ends. It is not ordinary quiet. It is a silence filled with what almost happened. A trace almost began. A word almost revealed something. A voice almost became a place. Then the line clicked, and the house was left with itself again. The investigators could write down the time. They could record what was said. They could compare it with earlier calls. But they still could not write down a name. The reports about the calls also suggest something that made the family feel especially exposed. The caller seemed at times to know when Jacob Scott was away from the house. That detail, if accurate, carried a heavy implication. It suggested observation, or inside knowledge, or a familiarity with the family's schedule. It did not prove which one, but it changed the feeling of the calls. They were not random interruptions from a distant stranger, or at least they did not feel that way. They felt timed. They felt chosen. A house can feel different when someone unseen seems to know who is inside it. Investigators had to consider whether the caller was watching the Scott home. They had to consider whether he knew the family through someone else. They had to consider whether he was guessing and happened to be right often enough to sound informed. That is the difficulty with behavior as evidence. It points. It suggests. It forms a shape, but it does not always allow a person to say, this is the only possible explanation. A caller who knows a schedule might be nearby. He might have access to family information. He might work with someone who talks too freely. He might be relying on patterns. All of those possibilities are different. All have to be tested. The family kept going. That is an important sentence, and it should be allowed to rest for a moment. They kept going. They cared for Dorothy's son. They spoke with investigators. They answered questions. They lived inside a case that did not pause for their exhaustion. The outside world may have moved from headline to headline, but for the Scott family, the case remained in the room. It remained in the practical tasks of a day. It remained in the unanswered space where Dorothy should have been. For detectives, the calls became an emotional spine, but also an investigative problem. A voice can reveal many things, but only if it can be tied to a person. The caller's phrasing could be compared with earlier calls to Dorothy. His tone could be described. His words could be remembered. His timing could be logged. But without a recording clear enough to identify him, without a trace, and without another witness who could say, I know that voice, the investigation remained just outside the reach of certainty. This is one reason Dorothy's case became so hard to close. The central evidence was alive, but ungraspable. It arrived as sound. Then it was gone. There were likely moments when investigators believed a solution might be near. A caller may make a mistake. A person under strain may say too much. A pattern may narrow until a name becomes obvious. In some cases, repeated contact gives the offender away, but in this case the repetition did not produce that final step. It deepened the pattern without resolving it. It kept the family connected to the person who may have known the truth while denying them the truth itself. That is a particularly cruel kind of uncertainty. Still, the work continued. Police could not rely only on the telephone. They also had to keep returning to the physical timeline. The work meeting in Stanton, the drive to UCI Medical Center in Orange, the waiting room, the walk to the parking lot, the car passing the entrance, the later discovery of the burning car in Santa Ana. Each location had to be placed on a map. Each time had to be estimated. Each movement had to be checked against what was possible. The geography mattered because it could reveal whether the person behind the disappearance knew the area well. Orange County in 1980 was a place of suburbs, freeways, industrial parks, shopping centers, and stretches of open land that had not yet become what they would later become. Stanton, Orange, Santa Ana, and Anaheim were close enough to connect in a single night. They were also separate enough to complicate a search. A person could move through that area using familiar streets, cutting from one city into another without feeling far from home. The route from the hospital to the place where the car was found did not have to be mysterious. It had to be practical. Someone knew where to leave the vehicle, someone chose an alley, someone chose fire, and that choice made the car less useful. Fire does not only damage what can be seen, it can change the order of an investigation. A car might have offered fingerprints, impressions, fibers, or traces of where it had traveled. It might have held something overlooked by the person who abandoned it, but after it burned, investigators had few acquired details to collect. They could still document the condition of the car. They could still note where it was found. They could still treat it as part of the route, but much of what might have spoken softly from the seats, the doors, or the surfaces had been altered or lost. That loss mattered. It left the voice even more central. The caller may have understood this, or he may not have thought of evidence in that way. Investigators could not assume a level of planning without proof, but they could observe the result. Dorothy was missing. The car was separated from her. The car was burned. The voice continued. Together, those facts created a case built from absence and intrusion. Absence because Dorothy was gone. Intrusion because the caller kept entering the family's life. As weeks turned into months, the first intensity of the search began to change form. This does not mean people stopped caring. It means the work moved from immediate action into slower review. Fresh tips were checked. Old statements were read again. People who knew Dorothy were contacted more than once. The phone calls were documented. The possible meanings of the caller's knowledge were weighed. The case did not freeze all at once. It cooled in layers. A missing person investigation often has a visible first phase. Searches, questions, newspaper articles, posters, police activity that people can notice. But after that, the case enters a quieter phase that is no less important. The file grows thicker, the pace slows. The same facts are handled again and again, because sometimes the meaning of a fact changes when it is placed beside another one. A detail that seemed minor in June may matter in September. A name that seemed ordinary may become important after another call. A timeline that looked clear may shift when someone remembers a different hour. This is the work that happens away from public view. Dorothy's case asked investigators to hold several possibilities at once. The caller may have been the person responsible. The caller may have been connected to the person responsible. The caller may have been using real knowledge for attention. The caller may have learned details through the workplace or the newspaper. Each possibility required different work. If he was responsible, the investigation needed to identify him through behavior, access, and opportunity. If he was connected, detectives needed to find the chain between him and Dorothy. If he was only performing, then the true person might be somewhere else entirely. That uncertainty pulled time away. In a case like this, the lack of a clear suspect is not a small problem. It affects every decision. Search warrants need probable cause. Interviews need direction. Physical evidence needs someone to compare against. A voice needs a known voice for recognition. Without a suspect, the case becomes wider than it should be. It can include many men who knew of Dorothy, or could have learned about her. The more people included, the more work is required to exclude them. And exclusions can be just as slow as confirmations. You might imagine a detective making careful notes after each interview. This person knew Dorothy from work. This person had no known access to the hospital that night. This person heard about the spider bite afterward. This person did not know her home number. This person had an alibi, but it needs checking. This person seemed cooperative. This person seemed uneasy, though uneasiness is not evidence. Line by line, the file grows, but still, the central name does not appear. The calls to Dorothy before her disappearance remained one of the most important parts of the background. They suggested that the person had focused on her before the hospital night. This made the disappearance feel less like a sudden encounter and more like something connected to an existing pattern. But even that conclusion had to be handled carefully. Investigators could not simply assume the caller and the person responsible were the same. They had reason to think so. They had strong reason to look there. But investigation depends on proof. A pattern can lead detectives to a door. It cannot open the door by itself. The earlier caller had reportedly shifted between affectionate and threatening language. That shifting tone may have mattered to detectives. It suggested obsession, resentment, or a private fantasy that Dorothy did not share. But psychological meaning is not the same as identification. Many people can sound possessive. Many people can be angry when rejected. Many people can call from a hidden place and make themselves seem larger than they are. The work was not to describe the caller only. The work was to find him. One of the quiet difficulties in this case is that Dorothy had done many of the things people are told to do. She told others about the calls. She took the situation seriously. She did not keep the fear entirely to herself. Her family and people close to her knew something was wrong. And still, the calls did not produce enough evidence before she vanished. That fact is important because it shows the limits of caution. A person can be careful and still be vulnerable to someone else's secrecy. A family can be alert and still lack the tools to stop a hidden caller. In the months after May of 1980, the family's waiting became part of the public record in fragments. Stories about Dorothy repeated the essential facts: the strange phone calls, the hospital errand, the car moving past the entrance, the burned car, the later calls to her parents. Each retelling kept the case alive, but it also fixed certain images in place: a missing woman, a voice, a telephone. The case became known through those elements because they were the elements investigators had. A cold case is sometimes imagined as a forgotten case, but that is not always true. Sometimes a case is cold because it has been remembered too many times without changing. People know the facts. They know the sequence. But knowing the sequence was not the same as knowing the person behind it. That difference is where the case began to settle into its long, difficult middle. Investigators could list the movements of that night, but they could not yet make the list speak. They could place Dorothy at work. They could place her at the hospital. They could place her car leaving the hospital area and later burning in Santa Ana. But they could not place a known person in the driver's seat. A case can have a clear timeline and still remain deeply uncertain. The timeline is a frame. The answer has to fill it. In Dorothy's case, the frame was there, but the center stayed empty. The repeated calls to Jacob and Vera Scott made that emptiness feel occupied by someone. Not silent, not gone. Someone was still reaching into the case, one brief call at a time. For investigators, each call had to be treated as both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity was obvious. A living voice was making contact. The problem was just as obvious. The voice would not remain. In the early 1980s, telephone tracing was a slower, more physical process than people often imagine now. It depended on equipment, switching systems, operators, and time. Time was the thing the caller refused to give. A modern listener might think of a number appearing instantly, saved before anyone even answers. That was not the Scott family's world. Their phone rang, someone picked up, and the investigation depended on what happened in the next few seconds. The caller could ask one question, make one statement, and end the call. By the time anyone reacted, the line was quiet again. There was no neat record waiting in the kitchen. There was no simple screen with the answer glowing on it. So the family had to become part of the method. They had to answer calmly. They had to try to keep him talking. They had to listen for sounds behind him, for changes in tone, for anything that might later matter. That is a heavy thing to ask of people who are already waiting for news. It turns grief into a task. It turns the ringing phone into a small test of endurance. You can imagine a notebook near the telephone, a time written down, a phrase remembered, a note about whether Jacob was home, whether Vera answered, whether the caller sounded hurried or calm. Each entry would matter. Each entry would also fall short. The investigators needed the call to last. The caller seemed to understand that lasting was dangerous, so he kept the contact brief, and by keeping it brief, he kept control. Control is one of the quiet themes of this case. The caller controlled when Dorothy heard from him before she disappeared. He controlled when her parents heard from him afterward. He controlled the length of the calls. He controlled how much he said. But control can be studied. Even when it does not solve a case, it tells investigators something about the person they are looking for. This was not someone who called once and faded away. This was someone who returned. The return itself had meaning. It suggested that the person wanted the family to know he was still there, or wanted the police to know, or wanted to feel close to the case without stepping into it. Detectives could not build a charge from that feeling alone, but they could study it. They could ask who might have needed that kind of contact. They could ask who knew Dorothy well enough to focus on her, but not openly enough to be recognized. That question led back to Dorothy's life before the night at the hospital. It led back to work. It led back to people she knew casually. It led back to men who may have shown interest in her, or resented distance, or mistaken politeness for something else. This kind of review is careful, and it has to be fair. It is not enough to say someone was awkward. It is not enough to say someone seemed too interested. Investigators need more than discomfort. They need opportunity. They need access. They need a reason a person would know Dorothy's phone number. They need a reason a person would know her movements. They need a reason he might know about the hospital errand. The hospital detail remained especially important. The caller to the newspaper reportedly knew about Conrad Bostron's medical issue. That fact did not float freely in the world before the case was reported. It belonged first to the small group connected to that evening, so investigators had to decide how that knowledge could have traveled. It could have traveled through direct observation. It could have traveled through a co-worker. It could have traveled through conversation after Dorothy disappeared. It could have traveled through someone listening more closely than anyone realized. Each possibility changed the circle of inquiry. If the caller saw the hospital visit, the circle included the hospital and parking lot. If he heard it later, the circle included workplace conversations and friends of friends. If he already knew Dorothy's routine, the circle had to reach back weeks or months. The case file would have become a map of overlapping circles. Dorothy's home circle, her work circle, her family circle, the hospital circle, the phone calls. The burned car, some names may have appeared in more than one circle. Those names would have received closer attention. But closer attention is not the same as proof. A person could know Dorothy from work and have no connection to the calls. A person could know about the hospital visit and still have no role in her disappearance. A person could sound nervous in an interview because the situation itself was frightening. Detectives had to avoid forcing the facts into a shape too early. That patience is hard. It is especially hard when a family is waiting and when the case seems to be offering a voice without a face. The caller's timing was another detail that could not be ignored. Reports suggested he sometimes called when Dorothy's father was away. If true, that would mean he had information about the household, or he was watching, or he was fortunate in a way that looked deliberate. Investigators would have had to consider all of those options. A watchful person could learn a family's habits. A connected person could hear about them. A guessing person could sometimes be right. This is where suspicion spreads outward. Not wildly, not carelessly, but steadily. Because one odd fact asks for another question, and another question asks for another interview. Was the Scott home visible from a place someone could wait? Did neighbors notice unfamiliar cars? Did anyone call and hang up without speaking? Did Dorothy ever describe the voice in a way that sounded like someone known to her? The answers, as far as the public record shows, did not bring the case to a single person. There were leads, there were theories, there were names considered, but no confirmed suspect was placed before the public as the answer. And so the calls continued to occupy the center. They were too important to ignore. They were too incomplete to close the file. A voice can be remembered in a family, It can be described as soft, harsh, calm, hurried, familiar, unfamiliar. But memory of a voice is fragile. It changes with stress. It becomes tied to fear. If you have ever tried to remember exactly how someone sounded years before, you understand the problem. A voice is not like a fingerprint. It does not sit still. It lives in the moment, and then it becomes memory. There may have been attempts to compare the later calls with what Dorothy had described earlier, the tone, the kind of words, the pattern of switching between attachment and threat. But those comparisons could only go so far. Dorothy was not there to hear the later calls and say, yes, that is him. Her family could hear the caller. They could endure him, but they could not make the missing link for her. That is another quiet cruelty of the case. The person who may have best recognized the voice was the person no longer able to speak. As the months passed, the investigation had to make space for uncertainty without accepting defeat. That is one of the hardest balances in police work. You keep the case open, you keep the family informed, you keep checking leads. But you also know that some facts may never arrive. There are cases where one new witness changes everything. There are cases where a hidden item is found in a garage. There are cases where a person finally confesses to someone else. There are cases where old evidence waits for new science. Dorothy's case in those early years was not yet that kind of case. It was a case waiting for the caller to become traceable. It was a case waiting for a memory to sharpen. It was a case waiting for Dorothy herself to be found. That last waiting was the largest one. For years, Dorothy was missing. Not confirmed in any final way, not returned, not explained. A missing person case holds a particular kind of hope, even when hope becomes very thin. Families know the odds, investigators know the patterns. But until there is a confirmed answer, the mind leaves a door open. That door is not always bright. Sometimes it is only a narrow line of light beneath it. Still, it remains. For Jacob and Vera Scott, that meant living with two tasks at once. They had to grieve what seemed likely. They also had to wait for what was not yet proven. They cared for Dorothy's young son. They answered questions from police and reporters. They lived through dates that would have been ordinary, and dates that could not be ordinary anymore. Birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of the night she vanished, the small day-to-day moments when a daughter's absence becomes part of every room. The investigation did not stop, but it slowed into the rhythm of cold work. A detective could return to a statement. A reporter could ask again. A family member could remember a phrase Dorothy had once used. The phone might ring again. A tip might come in. A person might say, I knew someone who talked about that case. Each possibility had to be handled, but none could be assumed. Cold cases are not only cold because time has passed, they are cold because the available paths have been walked many times. They are cold because each promising road has either ended or narrowed. In Dorothy's case, the path through the telephone kept narrowing but never closing. The path through the car had been damaged by fire. The path through the hospital was limited by the brief sighting and the lack of a clear driver. The path through personal connections produced concern, but not a public arrest. So the case waited. It waited in offices, it waited in boxes, it waited in memories, it waited beside a family phone. Then, after more than 4 years, the case changed in a way that was concrete but not complete. The change came in August of 1984. By then, Orange County had moved through 4 summers since Dorothy disappeared. Roads had filled and emptied thousands of times. Newspapers had printed other stories. People had changed jobs, moved houses, raised children, and carried private worries forward. But the file had not truly gone away. It was still there. It was still waiting for one of its missing facts. In early August, human remains were found near Santa Ana Canyon Road in the Anaheim Hills area. The location was in the dry landscape east of the older, denser parts of Orange County. It was a place of slopes, brush, roads, and open stretches where the city did not feel as close. Reports described the discovery as coming years after Dorothy vanished, in an area removed from the hospital and the alley where her car was found. That distance mattered. It created another point on the map. Now the geography of the case had a new marker: Stanton, Orange, Santa Ana, Anaheim Hills. Each place belonged to a different part of the story. The discovery did not immediately answer every question. It could not, but it gave investigators something they had not had before. It gave them Dorothy's confirmed location after years of absence. Identification came through dental records and personal items. Reports have mentioned jewelry among the belongings that helped connect the remains to Dorothy Jane Scott. The details were enough to turn a missing person case into something more final. That change is difficult to describe gently, but it matters. For the family, one question was answered. Dorothy had been found, but the answer came with another kind of ache. It did not say who had taken her. It did not say how the person had kept his name hidden. It did not say why the phone had kept ringing for so long. A discovery after several years can be both a mercy and a setback. It brings certainty about identity. It also reveals how much evidence time has taken away. Outdoor conditions do not preserve a scene the way investigators would wish. Weather changes things. Animals may disturb things. Sun, rain, wind, and time all do their quiet work. By August of 1984, the place where Dorothy was found could not speak the way it might have spoken in May of 1980. That was the hard forensic reality. The case had gained a location, but lost the freshness of that location. The cause and exact circumstances of Dorothy's death could not be clearly established from what remained publicly known. That limit mattered. It meant investigators still lacked a complete sequence. They could confirm who had been found. They could place her in the Anaheim Hills area. They could compare that place to the hospital, the burned car, and the calls. But they could not yet say with public certainty how every step had unfolded. The discovery narrowed the emotional mystery. It did not narrow the legal mystery enough. That is why the case remained open. After the identification, detectives had to read the entire file again through the new location. Every old detail had to be placed beside Santa Ana Canyon Road. Who knew that area? Who drove that area? Who might have had reason to go there in 1980? Who could have moved through Orange County at night without drawing attention? A new location changes old questions. It can make some theories less likely. It can make others more important. It can show whether a person knew back roads, open areas, or places where someone might not be found for a long time. The Anaheim Hills area in the early 1980s was not the same as it would become later. Parts of Orange County were growing quickly. Some places were already suburban. Others still held stretches of undeveloped land, brush, and dry hillsides. A person who knew the area might have understood that remains could go unnoticed there. A person who did not know it well might have chosen it simply because it was quiet and away from the hospital. Both possibilities had to be considered. Investigators would have looked at access, roads, turnouts, nearby developments, construction activity, sightlines. They would have asked whether the location suggested planning, convenience, familiarity, or chance. Those are different things. They can look similar after years have passed. The time gap made everything harder. If Dorothy had been found quickly, investigators might have searched the area for tire marks, footprints, fibers, or objects left behind. They might have interviewed nearby residents while memories were fresh. They might have connected a strange car to a specific evening, but in 1984, the questions had to reach backward across 4 years. Who lived nearby then? Who worked nearby then? Who was driving those roads then? Who remembered anything from a night that had not seemed important at the time? Memory over 4 years is not empty, but it is softened. People remember unusual events. They remember smells of smoke, loud sounds, strange vehicles, conversations, or fear. But an ordinary car on an ordinary road may vanish from memory almost immediately. That is one reason delayed discovery can keep a case cold. The evidence is finally present, but the surrounding world has moved on. Still, the discovery gave investigators a reason to return to the file with new purpose. They could compare the location to people previously interviewed. They could ask whether any person of interest had ties to Anaheim Hills. They could examine whether the caller's behavior changed after Dorothy was found. The calls to the family became even more important after the discovery. If the caller truly knew Dorothy's fate, then he had been speaking from a position of knowledge for years. If he did not, Then he had been exploiting a missing person case with remarkable persistence. Either possibility was serious, but the first possibility remained central. The caller seemed too close to the facts to ignore. The question was whether that closeness could ever be proven. A person can know something because he did it. A person can know something because he saw it. A person can know something because he was told. A person can claim knowledge and still be wrong. That difference is small in wording, but large in the work. It is the difference between a lead and a charge. It is the difference between someone sounding close and someone being placed at the center by evidence. After Dorothy was identified, investigators could no longer frame the case as a search for a missing woman. They now had to frame it as a long-delayed search for the person who had taken her from ordinary life. That change gave the file a heavier shape, but not necessarily a clearer one. The same facts remained: the calls, the hospital, the car, the alley, the dry hills near Santa Ana Canyon Road. Each fact now had to be handled with more care, because each one might be connected to the final movement of Dorothy's life. But care is not the same as clarity. A location can answer one question and open 10 more. Why that road? Why that area? Why was she not found sooner? Who knew how to reach that place? Who could move through those roads without hesitation? Investigators would have understood that the discovery point might not be the place where everything happened. It might have been only where Dorothy was left. That possibility matters because it separates two kinds of knowledge. One person might know the hospital. Another person might know Santa Ana. Another might know the Anaheim Hills. But the person responsible, if acting alone, may have known all three well enough to link them in a single night. So the map became a quiet tool, not a dramatic map with red string and sudden certainty, just a practical map. Roads, distances, freeways, industrial areas, places where traffic thinned after midnight. The drive from the University of California Irvine Medical Center in Orange to Santa Ana was not especially long. The drive from Santa Ana toward the Anaheim Hills was also within the familiar reach of someone who lived or worked in Orange County. That closeness made the case both easier and harder. Easier because the movements were physically possible. Harder because many people could have made them. A suspect did not have to be a traveler from far away. He did not have to cross state lines. He only had to know the local pattern of streets, exits, and darkened places. Local knowledge can hide in plain sight. A person who grew up nearby has it. A worker who moves between towns has it. A person who watches someone's routine can slowly learn it. By 1984, detectives had to ask whether the person behind the calls had been local enough to see Dorothy and patient enough to remain unnamed. That combination is difficult. It suggests closeness without obvious exposure. The caller seemed to know enough to frighten her before she disappeared. He seemed to know enough to speak afterward, yet he had not been recognized, at least not in a way that could be made public as proof. That is the strange outline of this case. The suspect shape is near, but the suspect name is absent. A shape can be made from behavior. Someone calls repeatedly, someone knows movements, someone uses affection and threat in the same breath. Someone reaches the family after the disappearance. Someone avoids staying on the line long enough to be traced. Those behaviors draw a boundary. Inside that boundary is the person investigators wanted. But a boundary is not a face. To move from behavior to identification, detectives needed something more fixed. A witness who recognized the voice. A telephone trace, a physical link to the car, a connection to the hospital, a tie to Santa Ana Canyon Road. Without one of those anchors, the case remains suspended between strong suspicion and legal proof. That space can last for years. It is not empty time. It is time filled with checking, reviewing, ruling out, and returning. Investigators likely returned to Dorothy's workplace again in thought, because work was one of the few places where many facts overlapped. Work explained how someone might know her schedule. Work explained how someone might know her co-workers. Work explained how someone might hear about Conrad Bostron's medical issue. The shop in Stanton was not just a location on paper. It was a social circle. People spoke there. People noticed who arrived and who left. People heard bits of personal information, sometimes without realizing they had learned something important. In many investigations, workplaces are full of small unguarded details. A phone number written down, a comment about a meeting, a mention of staying late, a casual line about taking someone to the hospital. None of those details feels dangerous at the time. They are only pieces of a normal day. But afterward, investigators have to ask where each piece could have traveled. Who knew Dorothy would be at the meeting? Who knew she was helping Bostrom? Who knew she owned the car seen at the hospital? Who might have followed without being noticed? The workplace path was important, but it was also sensitive. To investigate a workplace is to ask people to look at one another differently. It can make ordinary relationships feel suddenly uncertain. A co-worker may remember an odd remark. Another may remember nothing unusual. Someone may have seemed interested in Dorothy, but that interest might have been harmless. Someone may have been quiet, but quietness proves nothing. Detectives had to move through that circle without turning every uneasy impression into an accusation. That is a patient kind of discipline. It is much easier, in the mind, to make a story. It is much harder to prove one. Dorothy's life outside work also had to be reviewed. Friends, family acquaintances, neighbors, people who knew her phone number, people who knew she was a single mother, people who may have seen her routines from a distance. The caller before her disappearance reportedly sounded as if he knew her personally, or wanted her to believe that he did. That distinction matters. A person can truly know someone. A person can also construct a sense of intimacy through watching. He might have known where she went, not because she told him, but because he observed her. He might have known her schedule, not because he belonged to her inner life, but because routine leaves patterns. Routines are useful to families, to employers, and to children. They are also visible to anyone patient enough to notice them. A car leaves at a certain time, a light comes on, a child is picked up, a shift begins, a call is answered. In Dorothy's case, the caller's knowledge created the feeling that her routine had been studied. Investigators could not know exactly how, but they could not ignore the possibility this is where the case becomes less about one night and more about the weeks before it. The night at the hospital may have been the moment of action, but the calls suggest that attention began earlier. That earlier attention is one reason investigators would have looked for someone who had been present in Dorothy's life before the 28th of May. Not necessarily close in a warm sense, present enough to observe, present enough to call, present enough to understand that she would be frightened by what he knew. There is a quiet difference between access and intimacy. Access can be practical. A person can access information through a shared workplace, a phone list, a mutual friend, or simple observation. Intimacy is personal. The caller seemed to want the power of intimacy, whether or not he truly had it. That may have been one of the most difficult things for investigators to measure. Was the voice familiar because Dorothy knew him, or because he had learned enough to imitate familiarity? If Dorothy had recognized him, perhaps she might have said so. But the public record does not show a named man she clearly identified as the caller. That absence matters. It suggests that either she did not recognize him, or she was unsure, or she did not have enough information to accuse anyone. Uncertainty protects the guilty when the guilty are careful. It also protects the innocent from being named too quickly. That is why detectives have to live with it longer than anyone would like. In the years after Dorothy was found, the investigation kept returning to the caller because he remained the most distinctive part of the case. Many missing person cases have unclear timelines. Many have vehicles found away from the last known location. But Dorothy's case had an added element. A voice had been present before. A voice returned afterward. A voice seemed to know facts. That voice became the center because it behaved like a thread. It ran through the fear before the disappearance, the public claim after it, and the calls to the family. If all of those calls came from the same man, then the thread was strong. If some came from different people, the thread became tangled. Detectives had to consider both. A single caller would suggest one focused person who stayed close to the case over time. Multiple callers would mean the investigation had to separate the true source from the false noise. That separation is not simple. A hoax caller may sound confident, a true caller may reveal little, a person with second-hand knowledge may repeat facts as if he owns them. So investigators looked for details that were not public. They listened for consistency. They considered timing. They asked whether the caller seemed to know information before it had spread. The call to the newspaper remained important because of that issue. The man reportedly knew about the hospital errand in a way that felt too specific to dismiss. But after newspaper coverage began, the amount of public information widened. Every article changed the pool of what a stranger could know. That is one of the practical costs of publicity. It can bring help. It can also make the evidence noisier. A tipster may call with good intentions but mistaken memory. A person may connect unrelated details. A caller may repeat what he read and add his own invention. Detectives have to receive all of it, sort it, and keep from being pulled too far by any one voice. That is slow work. You can imagine the file after the discovery in 1984. The first section would hold the original missing person reports. The next would hold interviews from co-workers. Then the hospital timeline. Then the car recovery. Then records of calls. Then the discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road. Each new page did not replace the old pages. It sat on top of them, and every added page made the file more complete, but also more complex. A simple answer is easy to want. The file did not give one. Instead, it gave investigators a set of constraints. The caller knew Dorothy, or knew of her. The person responsible likely had access to her at the hospital or followed her there. The car was moved and burned. Dorothy was later found in a separate location. The caller continued to make contact without being traced. Those constraints were meaningful. They helped rule out certain possibilities, but they did not point to one public name. In a courtroom, meaningful is not enough. The standard is higher, as it should be. A case cannot be built only on the feeling that one person fits. It needs proof that withstands time, challenge, and doubt. Dorothy's case had many pieces that felt connected, but the connection between them had to be demonstrable. This is one reason a case can feel solved in private conversation and still remain unsolved in law. People can say, it must have been someone close. They can say, it must have been the caller. They can say, it must have been a man who knew her schedule. Those statements may be reasonable. They may even be likely, but likelihood is not a conviction. The file needed the caller's name. It needed something that placed him in the movement of the case. It needed the bridge from voice to person. Without that bridge, investigators could stand at either end and see the other side, but not cross. The burned car is another reason the bridge was difficult to build. A vehicle can hold evidence in small, stubborn ways. Fingerprints on a handle, a hair caught in fabric, a fiber on a seat, a receipt left under a mat. But fire can damage or destroy those traces. It can turn a car from a source of evidence into a question of location and timing. The recovery in Santa Ana still mattered. It showed that the car left the hospital area. It showed someone chose to abandon it away from the last confirmed sighting. It suggested an effort to interrupt the investigative trail. But the fire limited what could be learned from the car itself. That limit pressed the investigation back toward witnesses and calls. The hospital sighting had its own limit. Pamela Head and Conrad Bostron saw Dorothy's car pass by quickly, but could not identify the driver. That fact was both crucial and incomplete. It confirmed movement. It did not confirm identity. The driver could have been Dorothy under circumstances no one could see clearly. The driver could have been someone else. The speed and failure to stop suggested something was wrong, but the witnesses could not make the image sharper. Investigators had to live with that. They could not ask the moment to replay itself. At night, under hospital lights, through glass and distance, a quick passing car gives only so much. A witness remembers the car. A witness remembers confusion. A witness may remember motion more than a face. That is not a failure of the witness. It is the nature of the moment. People are not recording devices. They are people waiting for a friend to bring the car around. The expectation was ordinary. Because the expectation was ordinary, their minds were not yet searching for danger. That matters. A witness who does not know a crime is unfolding will notice different things than one who already feels alarm. Pamela and Conrad expected Dorothy to return. Only afterward did the passing car become a detail they would revisit again and again. This is one of the quiet pains of witness memory. A person may remember what they saw and also remember what they did not know they needed to see. They may wonder if they missed something. They may replay the car. They may ask themselves whether a face, a movement, or a posture was visible for a second. Investigators can ask. Witnesses can try. But the past does not sharpen just because everyone needs it to. So the hospital gave the file a turning point, not a face. The car gave the file a route, not a person. The discovery gave the file a location, not a perpetrator. The calls gave the file a voice, not a name. That is why Dorothy's case took on the shape of a cold case, even while people were still actively working it. The major elements were there. The missing link was not. After 1984, the investigation had to shift again. It was no longer waiting for Dorothy to be found. It was waiting for the caller to be identified. That meant rereading old interviews with a different emphasis. Who had access to her number? Who knew her route? Who could have learned about the hospital? Who had connections to Santa Ana or Anaheim Hills? Who might have been careful with phones? Sometimes, a cold case advances because a new fact appears. Other times, it advances because an old fact is placed beside a new context. The Santa Ana Canyon Road discovery was that new context. It did not solve the case, but it changed how old names and old movements could be evaluated. If a person of interest had ties to that area, the tie might matter more after 1984 than it did before. If someone had worked near Anaheim Hills, driven routes there, or spoken of that place, detectives would want to know. But again, a tie to a place is not enough by itself. Many people know a road, many people drive through hills, many people have innocent reasons to pass through an area. Evidence has to narrow, it has to hold, it has to connect the person to Dorothy, not just to a landscape. That is the difference between coincidence and proof. Investigators had to be careful not to confuse the two. A cold case can be harmed by certainty that arrives too soon. Once a theory hardens, other possibilities can be missed. The best detectives keep the facts firm and the interpretations flexible. They ask again. They read again. They allow a detail to mean something new without forcing it to. Dorothy's case demanded that kind of restraint. It contained emotional facts that were powerful. A mother gone, a family called, a voice returning. A car burned. Those facts invite anger, and anger is understandable. But anger cannot do the work of evidence. The work remained slow. Names had to be checked. Alibis had to be compared. Old reports had to be preserved. Call details had to be reviewed for timing and content. Investigators may also have considered whether the caller had changed his behavior after Dorothy was found. Did the calls stop? Did they continue? Did the tone shift? Did he reveal anything that only the discovery could explain? Public accounts vary in how much they describe later calls, but the central fact remains. The caller's identity was not confirmed. That absence stayed at the heart of the case. It still does. When a suspect cannot be named publicly, people often ask whether investigators had someone in mind. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they have several people. Sometimes they have a profile, a pattern, or a narrowed circle, but no proof. In Dorothy's case, public reporting has long suggested that investigators considered the caller likely connected to her disappearance. That is a significant belief. But belief, even investigative belief, is not the same as a solved case. The file needed a way to make the voice stand still, a recording, a trace, a witness, a confession, a physical link. Without that, the caller remained like a figure seen through frosted glass, close enough to outline, not clear enough to identify. This is where the phrase cold case can be misleading. Cold does not mean still. It means the obvious heat has faded. What remains is a steadier light, the kind used in storage rooms, archives, and old detective bureaus. It is the light over a cardboard box, over typed reports, over photographs handled by many careful hands. By the time Dorothy's case entered its long cold period, the investigation had become less visible to the public. But less visible does not mean less present. A detective may no longer be knocking on doors every day. A reporter may no longer be writing about every development. A family may no longer see search activity in the same way. Still, the file remains in a drawer, and the questions remain attached to names, places, and dates. That is the quieter life of a case like Dorothy Jane Scott's. It waits for a witness to speak again. It waits for a record to be found. It waits for a small inconsistency to become meaningful. Sometimes the waiting lasts so long that the case begins to belong to more than one generation. The first investigators age, the first reporters move on, children become adults. But the facts do not age in the same way. They remain fixed on the page, even when the people around them change. Dorothy was last seen in May of 1980. Her remains were identified in August of 1984. Between those two dates and after them, the investigation carried the same central absence. The caller was still unnamed. That one fact shaped everything that followed. If you are reading the file years later, you may find yourself drawn again to the telephone records. Not because they contain the answer, but because they show where the answer almost appeared. There may be notes about the times of calls. There may be summaries of what was said. There may be references to attempts at tracing the line. Each note is a little mark of patience. Someone answered. Someone listened. Someone wrote it down. That kind of record keeping can feel ordinary, but in a cold case, ordinary records matter deeply. They are the memory of the investigation when human memory becomes uncertain. A detective reviewing the case years later would need those notes to understand the rhythm. When did the caller choose to make contact? How long did he usually stay on the line? What did he repeat? What did he avoid? What did he seem to know? What did he seem to want? Those questions do not produce a name on their own, but they help define the person investigators were trying to find. A person's pattern can become a kind of handwriting, not proof by itself, but still a clue to how he moved through the case. The repeated calls suggested someone who wanted contact, but not exposure. Someone who wanted to be heard, but not found. That combination made the investigation especially difficult. It offered detectives a path, while refusing to let them walk it to the end. As years passed, the technical world changed around the case. Telephones became easier to trace. Caller identification became more common. Recording devices became more available. But these improvements arrived after the most important calls had already been made. That is one of the difficult truths of cold case work. Technology can improve, but it cannot always go backward and capture what was never preserved. A call that was not recorded in 1980 cannot be recorded later. A number that was never captured cannot be printed decades afterward. A voice that existed only in memory cannot be tested like an object. So later investigators had to work with what earlier investigators could save. They inherited the limits of the original moment. In a way, every cold case is a conversation between past and present. The present asks better questions. The past answers only with what it kept. In Dorothy's case, the past kept the timeline. It kept witness accounts, it kept the location of the burned car, it kept the discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road, it kept the memory of a caller. But it did not keep the caller's name. That meant later reviews had to be careful and realistic. A new detective could not simply apply modern tools to every old fact. Some facts were physical, some were spoken. Some were remembered. Some had been changed by time, fire, weather, or fear. The car, for example, remained a central piece of the sequence, but because it had been found burning, it was not the same kind of evidence it might have been. A later forensic review could ask what was documented at the time. It could ask whether any photographs, samples, or reports remained. But if certain traces were destroyed in 1980, they could not be recovered by wishing. The fire had already done its quiet work. That is why preservation matters so much in cold cases. A single envelope, a single swab, a single photograph can become more useful decades later. But only if it exists. Only if it was collected. Only if it was stored in a way that allowed later testing. Dorothy's case came from an era before DNA testing became the familiar tool it is now. Investigators in 1980 did not have the same expectations about biological evidence. They also did not have the same databases, the same digital records, or the same mapping tools. They worked with interviews, paper, phones, photographs, and local knowledge. That does not mean they worked poorly. It means they worked within their time. Every investigation belongs to the tools and habits of its period. Later, cold case detectives must understand those tools before judging the gaps. A missing record may mean a mistake. It may also mean the record never existed in that system. A lack of forensic results may mean no evidence was found. It may also mean the evidence was not testable then or not preserved for later. This is the patient fairness required when an old case is opened again. You cannot assume the past had what the present has. You have to meet the file where it is. You have to read its silence as carefully as its words. Dorothy's file had many words. It also had many silences. There was silence around the driver of the car. There was silence around the caller's location. There was silence around the exact path from the hospital to the later discovery site. There was silence around what Dorothy may have seen in the parking lot. That silence may have held the answer, but it left no statement behind. A cold case detective learns to sit with silences without filling them too quickly. That discipline is part of the work. It is tempting to place a theory into every empty space. It is tempting to make the unknown feel orderly. But a theory is only useful when it helps find evidence. If it begins replacing evidence, it can lead the case away from itself. So the older Dorothy's case became, the more important restraint became. Every later review had to ask what was known and what was only believed. Known, Dorothy was at the hospital that night. Known, she went to bring the car around. Known, the car passed the entrance and did not stop. Known, the car was later found burning in Santa Ana. Known, Dorothy was identified years later near Santa Ana Canyon Road. Reported, the caller had harassed her before she disappeared. Reported, a man called the newspaper and claimed knowledge. Reported, the Scott family received repeated calls afterwards. These facts and reports formed the structure. The missing name remained outside it. When investigators review an old file, they often begin by separating categories. What was directly witnessed, what was reported secondhand, what was documented by police, what was said in newspapers, what was repeated later, what became part of public memory. This sorting matters because cold cases can gather extra layers over time. A phrase from one article can become a fact in another retelling. A detail can be remembered slightly differently. A rumor can begin to stand beside evidence, even if it never belonged there. Dorothy's case has been retold many times because it is unsettling and unresolved. Each retelling has carried the same basic outline, but a careful review still has to go back to the earliest sources, the first police reports, the first witness statements, the first newspaper accounts. Those early sources are closest to the events. They are not perfect, but they are closer to the original temperature of the case. Later accounts may be useful, especially if they include interviews with family or investigators, but they have to be compared against the earlier record. That comparison is slow work. It is not dramatic. It is a matter of placing one sentence beside another and noticing what changes. A time may shift by a few minutes. A description may gain a word. A location may be named more broadly or more specifically. Sometimes the difference means nothing. Sometimes it reveals that a detail was uncertain from the beginning. Sometimes it shows that people have been repeating a simplified version for years. That is not unusual. Public memory likes clear shapes. Investigations often have rougher edges. In Dorothy's case, the public shape is simple enough to remember. The calls came first. The hospital night followed. The car was burned. The family received calls. Dorothy was found years later. The caller was never identified. But inside that shape are many smaller questions. Who knew the meeting schedule? Who knew Conrad Bostrom needed medical treatment? Who knew Dorothy would be the one to get the car? Who could approach her without drawing attention? Who could drive her car away? Who could later call with confidence? Each smaller question required its own careful search. No single question could be answered by feeling alone. A cold case review often begins with a timeline board or a written chronology. Everything is placed in order, even the details that seem settled. The purpose is not only to remember, the purpose is to see the gaps honestly. The timeline for Dorothy's final confirmed night has a narrow, important space. It is the space between her leaving the hospital entrance area and the car passing by. That short interval may have contained the most important encounter in the case, but publicly, it remains unfilled. Investigators could estimate how long it should have taken to reach the car. They could ask where the car had been parked. They could consider sightlines and lighting. They could ask whether someone might have been waiting near the vehicle. They could ask whether someone followed her from work or from the hospital. They could ask whether she recognized the person enough to lower her guard. That question matters, but it cannot be answered from the outside. If Dorothy saw someone she knew, the moment may have felt confusing before it felt dangerous. If she saw a stranger, the moment may have unfolded differently. Investigators had to consider both, because the file did not preserve her perception. No report can tell us what she thought in that parking lot. This is where compassion has to guide the retelling. Dorothy was not a clue. She was a person moving through a difficult moment. She had spent the evening helping a co-worker. She was expected back at the entrance. She had a child and family waiting in the wider world of her life. The case file must reduce life into facts, because that is how investigation works. But the person was larger than the file. Cold case detectives know that, even if they rarely write it in formal language. They know that each name belongs to rooms, meals, habits, and people who still remember. That knowledge can sustain a case for years. It can also make the failure to solve it feel personal. A detective may retire with certain cases still in mind. A reporter may keep a folder long after the story is no longer new. A family member may remember the sound of the phone more clearly than any printed article. That is how a case stays alive outside the evidence room. Dorothy's parents, Jacob and Vera, carried the case in a way no investigator could. They were not reviewing an assignment. They were living with the absence of their daughter. The calls to their home made that absence active. They turned waiting into something repeatedly interrupted. And because those calls could not be traced to a name, the family was left with both contact and powerlessness. That is a hard combination. In later years, investigators looking back would understand those calls as one of the case's strongest signs, but they would also understand them as one of its greatest frustrations. The calls showed that someone wanted to insert himself into the family's grief. They did not show where he was. The calls suggested knowledge. They did not prove how he gained it. The calls felt connected, but connection still had to be established in evidence. This is why the case did not move cleanly from suspicion to arrest. The gap was not a lack of concern. It was a lack of something firm enough to stand in court. A prosecutor cannot present only a haunting pattern. A prosecutor needs proof that ties a person to acts, places, and decisions. That proof can be physical. It can be testimonial. It can be circumstantial if the chain is strong enough. But the chain has to hold. In Dorothy's case, the public record does not show a chain strong enough to name and charge one person. It shows a set of links that seem to belong together, but somewhere between those links the connection thinned. The voice was one link, the hospital was another, the car was another, the Canyon Road area was another. Investigators could see them in sequence. What they needed was the person who moved through them. That person remained unnamed, and because he remained unnamed, every other piece had to carry more weight. The workplace, for instance, remained important because it could explain knowledge. A co-worker, customer, acquaintance, or nearby observer might know pieces of Dorothy's routine. A workplace can be porous in ways people do not notice. Schedules are spoken aloud, phone numbers are written down, people mention appointments. Someone says they are staying late. Someone says they are going to a meeting. Someone says a co-worker is not feeling well. These are ordinary exchanges. They are not guarded because they do not seem dangerous. A person can learn a great deal without ever being invited into someone's private life. That is why investigators had to treat casual access as meaningful, even when it did not look dramatic. A customer may hear a name at a counter. A co-worker may see a phone number on a message pad. A visitor may notice which car belongs to which employee. None of that proves anything by itself, but together, those details can explain how a stranger begins to sound familiar. Dorothy's caller seemed to benefit from small information. He did not need to know everything, he only needed to know enough to make his calls feel close. That closeness was one of the reasons the case stayed difficult. It widened the suspect circle beyond obvious friends and family. Investigators had to consider people who stood near the edge of Dorothy's life. People who were present, but not central. people who knew her name but perhaps not her heart. This kind of person is hard to find in a file. They do not always appear in photographs. They may not be listed as close contacts. They can pass through a workplace, a parking lot, or a shared errand, leaving almost no mark. So, detectives had to work outward from what could be verified. They could ask who had regular contact with the shop in Stanton. They could ask who knew Dorothy's schedule. They could ask who had shown unusual interest in her. They could also ask who might have been missing from the obvious lists. That last question is often important in cold cases. The person who matters most is not always the person everyone remembers first. Sometimes the person is known only through a short description. A man who came by often, a voice on the phone, someone who seemed to linger, someone whose name was not written down. In Dorothy's case, the caller's identity may have been hiding in that kind of space. Not fully unknown, not fully known, somewhere in between. That is a difficult place for investigators to reach. The early interviews would have depended heavily on memory. Who had Dorothy mentioned? Who had upset her? Who had called before? Who may have wanted her attention? But Dorothy herself had not identified the caller publicly by name. That left investigators asking others to reconstruct a fear they had not heard firsthand. They could listen to what Dorothy had told them before she disappeared. They could compare those descriptions to people around her. They could test possible connections. Still, every step required caution. A person can behave oddly and be innocent. A person can be interested in someone and never cause harm. A person can be remembered unfairly once a tragedy has made every past detail seem darker. Good detective work has to protect against that. It has to keep compassion for Dorothy and fairness for everyone questioned. That balance is not easy, but it is part of why cases sometimes move slowly. A rushed accusation may feel like movement, but if it is wrong, it harms the case and the people around it. So investigators had to gather, compare, and wait. They had to accept that a strong feeling was not enough. They needed facts that could survive a second look. And a third, and a courtroom. The caller gave them fragments, but he did not give them his name. The hospital gave them a narrow window, but not a clear witness to the encounter. The burned car gave them a place in Santa Ana, but not the quiet traces they needed. The discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road gave them Dorothy, but after time had taken much of the scene's evidence, each development mattered. Each development also came with a limit. That is often how a cold case is built. Not from nothing, but from important things that stop just short of being enough. You can imagine a detective years later placing these limits in order. The calls were too brief. The car was damaged. The last sighting was unclear. The remains were found too late. The suspect circle was too wide. Those are not excuses. They are the practical walls inside the investigation. A careful detective does not ignore walls. They measure them, they look for doors, they ask whether some old assumption has made the room seem smaller than it is. That is why cold case review matters. It allows someone new to walk the same floor with different eyes. By the later years, Dorothy's case belonged partly to that quieter world, the world of old reports, archived newspaper stories, and people willing to remember again. A cold case unit, when it reviews an older file, often begins with inventory. What exists? What is missing? What was collected? What was never collected? The answer to those questions shapes every later possibility. If physical evidence remains, it may be tested with newer methods. If recordings remain, they may be enhanced or compared. If photographs remain, they may show details not noticed before. But when evidence was never captured, later technology has very little to hold. Dorothy's case had been shaped by 1980 from the beginning. The phones were 1980 phones. The police records were 1980 records. The forensic habits were the habits of that time. Later tools could help only where something had survived. That is a sober truth in old investigations. Science can move forward, but a missing record stays missing. A burned surface cannot always be made whole again. A call that ended in seconds cannot become a long recording decades later. The case, therefore, remained dependent on people. People who heard something, people who saw something, people who may have been told something in confidence. Human memory became both a resource and a problem. Memories can preserve what paper does not. They can also soften, blend, or reshape over time. A witness interviewed in 1980 might remember a clear sequence. The same witness in 1990 may remember the feeling more than the order. By 2000, the story may have been told and retold so often that the original memory is layered with later knowledge. This does not mean people are lying. It means memory is living material. Cold case detectives understand that. They do not treat every difference as deception. They ask where the difference began. They compare the earlier statement to the later one. They look for changes that matter. They also look for things that stayed the same. Consistency across time can be useful. So can a late detail if it explains something already documented. But a late detail must be handled gently, not rejected too quickly, not accepted too easily. Dorothy's case required that kind of patience, because the key moments were brief, because the key voice was not recorded in a way that solved it, because the key location was found years later. The file asked investigators to do careful work with fragile materials. There is a quiet humility in that kind of work. A detective has to admit what the file cannot say. This can be harder than it sounds. The mind wants to complete patterns. It wants to make a person out of a shadow. But the legal system asks for more than the comfort of a complete story. It asks for proof. In the Dorothy Jane Scott case, the shadow had a voice. That made it feel close. A silent suspect shape might have faded more easily, but this one kept speaking. The voice was remembered as the thread through the entire case. Before Dorothy disappeared, the voice called her. After she disappeared, the voice called others. After the story reached the public, a voice claimed knowledge. The repetition made the caller feel like the center, but the center was still hidden. Investigators could ask whether the caller had a distinctive way of speaking, a rhythm, a phrase, an accent, a hesitation. They could compare descriptions. They could ask whether anyone recognized him. They could ask whether a known person had ever used similar words. But voice identification is complicated, especially when the listener is under stress. A person may remember tone more clearly than exact sound. They may remember fear, anger, or stillness. They may remember one phrase, but not the breath before it. And if the caller changed his voice, spoke briefly, or chose his words carefully, recognition became even harder. That meant investigators needed another anchor, something outside the voice, a time, a place, a phone booth, a witness, a record. In 1980, phone booths still belonged to everyday life. A person could call from a public place and walk away. Payphones stood in gas stations, shopping areas, hospitals, bars, and along streets. They offered access without leaving an easy household connection. If the caller used public phones, tracing became more difficult. Even if a call could be traced to a booth, someone still had to connect that booth to a person. That would require timing, observation, a witness, perhaps a patrol close enough to respond. A brief call gave little opportunity. The caller seemed to understand that. He stayed just long enough to be heard, not long enough to be found. This pattern may have shown caution, or habit, or both. It also meant that each failed trace added to the case's quiet frustration. The family had done what they were asked to do. The police had tried to use the tools available. The caller had ended the call too soon. Again and again, the same structure repeated. Contact, hope, silence. In a case file, those repetitions can look small. A date, a time, a note that the call was too short to trace. But inside the house, each one would have been large. Each ring could draw everyone's attention. Each voice could reopen the same wound. That is why the human cost of the calls cannot be separated from their investigative value. They were evidence, in a broad sense. They were also an intrusion into a family trying to endure. Jacob and Vera Scott were not trained detectives. They became part of the investigation because the caller chose their home. That is a burden no family asks for. It is also one that families in unresolved cases often carry with remarkable steadiness. They answer questions. They provide photographs. They repeat painful timelines. They speak to reporters when attention might help. They keep the person they love from becoming only a case number. In Dorothy's case, Family memory helped preserve her as a mother, a daughter, and a working woman. Those details matter because unresolved cases can become abstract over time. They can become known for the mystery more than the person. A careful retelling has to return to the person. Dorothy was not only the subject of a file, she was someone who left a young son behind. She was someone who helped a co-worker on a late May night. She was someone who told others when the calls frightened her. That last point matters. Dorothy recognized that something was wrong. She did not treat the calls as nothing, and still the caller remained unnamed. That fact shows the difference between awareness and protection. A person can know they are being harassed and still not have enough information to stop it. A family can be concerned and still lack a suspect. Police can believe there is danger and still need evidence. The gap between concern and intervention can be very wide. In this case, that gap became part of the tragedy. When later readers ask why the case went cold, this is one of the first answers. The warning signs were real, but the warning signs were not yet proof. The caller had not left a reliable trail. He had not been identified before the hospital night. He had not stayed on the phone long enough afterward. So, the investigation began with a known pattern, but without a known person. That is a hard beginning. The second answer lies in the hospital window. Dorothy left to get her car. A short time later, the car passed by and did not stop. That moment is central because it appears to be the point where the evening changed. But it was also brief, unexpected, and visually incomplete. The witnesses could not identify the driver, they could not describe a conversation in the parking lot, they could not say what Dorothy encountered when she reached the car. That meant detectives had to reconstruct the crucial moment from its edges. Before, she was with co-workers. After, the car was moving away. The center of the moment remained out of sight. Cases often depend on what happens in the open. A camera, a witness, a receipt, a phone record. Here, the most important space was not preserved by any such thing, at least not in the public record. There was no clear image of the parking lot encounter, no confirmed person walking with Dorothy, no named driver. The investigation therefore had to infer what likely happened. But inference again could not replace proof. The third answer is the car. The car was found in Santa Ana, burning. That gave police an important location. It also reduced what the car might have offered. A vehicle can be a small archive of contact. It holds touch, movement, dust, fibers, and objects. When fire passes through that archive, many of those quiet records may be lost. The car still told investigators that someone had moved it away from the hospital. It showed an attempt to separate the vehicle from the last known point, but it could not give back everything it had once held. That is a practical reason the case cooled. One of the strongest physical links had been damaged early. The fourth answer is time. Dorothy was not found until August of 1984. Those 4 years mattered deeply. They gave weather, landscape, and distance time to alter what might have been learned. The discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road confirmed Dorothy's identity through dental records and personal items. That confirmation answered a painful question. But it came too late for the scene to speak fully. The exact circumstances could not be publicly established with the clarity investigators would have wanted. That meant the discovery changed the emotional state of the case more than the legal one. The family now knew Dorothy had been found. Investigators now had another location to map. But the person responsible remained outside reach. The fifth answer is the absence of a confirmed suspect. Many details suggested that the caller was important. The caller seemed to know Dorothy before she disappeared. The caller seemed to know details after. The caller returned to the family. But suspicion needs a name, and a name needs support. Without a trace, without a recording that identified him, without a witness tying him to the hospital, the caller stayed in the realm of strong possibility. This is the hardest kind of suspect shape. It feels distinct, yet remains uncharged. A detective can describe his behavior. They can say he likely had knowledge. They can say he may have watched Dorothy. But to proceed in law, they need to show who he was and why the evidence points to him, not simply to someone like him. That distinction is essential. A person who matches a pattern is not automatically the person. The evidence must narrow from many, to one. Dorothy's case never publicly completed that narrowing. This is why old case reviews often return to persons of interest even decades later. A person once considered and set aside may become important if a new fact appears. A statement once overlooked may change meaning. A connection to a road, a phone, or a workplace may deserve another look. But the review has to be anchored in what can be documented. If a name appears in a rumor, investigators ask where the rumor began. If a tip arrives years later, they ask what the tipster could truly know. They compare the claim to facts withheld from the public. They check whether the timeline can hold it. Most tips do not solve a case, but each tip must be given enough care to know whether it can be excluded. That is another quiet labor of cold casework. Not only finding the right answer, but patiently ruling out the wrong ones. Exclusion is rarely celebrated, yet it is essential. Every person ruled out honestly makes the case cleaner. Every false path closed keeps the investigation from wandering forever. In Dorothy's case, the public does not know every name examined or every lead checked. That is normal. Investigators often keep certain details private to protect the case. They may also protect people who were questioned but never charged. The public record is therefore incomplete by design. It tells us the outline, not the entire investigative interior. That incompleteness can frustrate people who study old cases, but it can also be necessary. If investigators still hope to identify the caller, some details may remain useful only if they are not widely known. A phrase from a call, a timing detail, a description of an item, a specific route. Those private facts can help separate a true witness from someone repeating public information. So when a case remains unsolved, silence does not always mean nothing is known. Sometimes it means something is being held back. At the same time, held back information cannot solve a case unless it connects to someone. The balance is delicate. Too much public information can invite false claims. Too little, and the one person who recognizes a fact may never know it matters. That is why public appeals in old cases are shaped with care. They have to open a door, but not empty the room. In Dorothy's case, later attention brought her name to people who had not been alive or aware in 1980. Podcasts, articles, local retrospectives, and cold case discussions gave the file a second public life. That second life could not change the original evidence, but it could change the number of eyes on it. Someone might have remembered a relative, someone might have remembered a co-worker, someone might have remembered a man who spoke too knowingly years after the fact. Cold cases sometimes turn on that kind of late memory. Not a dramatic confession necessarily, just a small sentence spoken at a kitchen table. I knew someone who called her. I knew someone who followed that case too closely. I knew someone who mentioned Santa Ana Canyon Road before it was in the papers. A sentence like that would still need testing. It would need dates, records, and comparison with known facts, but it could give investigators what they had been missing for decades: a name. That is why even an old, unresolved file is not completely still. It can move if someone brings a piece of it back into the light. The difficulty is that time also removes people from reach. Witnesses move away. Detectives retire. Parents pass on. Co-workers forget names that once felt familiar. The longer a case waits, the more the investigation depends on what was written down early. That is why the old notes matter so much. A report made in 1980 can become more valuable in 2000 than anyone expected at the time. It preserves a statement before memory has had years to soften it. It preserves the names of people who were close to the first circle. It preserves small facts that later retellings may leave behind. When a cold case detective opens a file like Dorothy's, the first act is often not searching outward, it is reading inward, page by page, line by line, name by name. You look for a detail that was recorded but never fully used. You look for a contradiction that was too small to matter then. You look for a person who appeared once, then disappeared from the paperwork. This kind of review asks for patience more than force. It is quiet labor. It is the work of returning to the same unanswered question without pretending the answer is easy. Why did the Dorothy Jane Scott case go cold? By the end, the reasons are not hidden. They are visible across the file. The first reason is the caller He was present enough to matter, but careful enough to remain unknown. Before Dorothy disappeared, he had already made himself part of her life through fear and intrusion. After she disappeared, a man with apparent knowledge reached the newspaper. Then the Scott family received calls that kept the voice near the center of the case. But the calls were brief. They did not give investigators the time they needed. They did not leave a clear trail. In a later era, a number might have appeared on a screen. A recording might have been saved. A location might have been traced more quickly. But Dorothy's case belonged to the phone systems of 1980. And in that world, seconds mattered. The caller understood, or simply sensed, that the line could not be held for long, so he stayed in the case, while staying out of reach. The second reason is the parking lot window. That small passage of time held the turning point. Dorothy left the hospital entrance area to bring her car around. Her co-workers expected a simple return. Instead, the car passed by without stopping. They could not identify the driver. That meant the most important visual moment in the case remained incomplete. The car was seen, but not the person controlling it. Investigators could infer that something changed between the parking space and the entrance. They could test possibilities. But the moment itself had no clear witness. No one could say, "I saw who approached her." No one could say, "I saw who drove away." And because of that, the case lost a direct path to identification. The third reason is the burned car. The car was found in Santa Ana, away from the hospital. That showed movement. It showed choice. It showed that someone separated the vehicle from the last known place Dorothy had been seen. But the fire harmed the car as evidence. It reduced the chance of recovering the small traces investigators often need. A car can remember touch in ways people do not. A handle, a seat, a mat, a window, a surface. But fire can erase those quiet records. It can leave the location while taking away the detail, so the car became an important fact with limited usefulness. It marked a route but did not name the driver. The fourth reason is the delayed discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road. Dorothy was not found until August of 1984. 4 years had passed since the night at the hospital. In those 4 years, the landscape changed what it could. Weather moved over the hills. Seasons passed. The area held its silence. When Dorothy was identified through dental records and personal items, the family received one answer: she had been found. But that answer did not bring a complete forensic picture. The passage of time limited what investigators could establish publicly about cause and exact circumstances. It also made surrounding witness work much harder. A strange car noticed in 1980 might not be remembered clearly in 1984. A sound, a light, or a person near the road may have seemed ordinary at the time. By the time it became important, the memory may have been gone. That is one of time's quiet effects on evidence. It does not always destroy in one sharp act. It simply asks everything to wait too long. The fifth reason is that the suspect shape never became a suspect name. Investigators could describe the kind of person they were looking for. Someone who knew Dorothy, or knew enough about her to seem close. Someone who may have understood her work routines. Someone who knew or learned details of the hospital visit. Someone who called with control, then disappeared before he could be traced. Those features are meaningful. Together, they create a narrow behavioral outline. But a court does not try an outline. A court tries a person. To move forward, investigators needed proof that connected one individual to the calls, the hospital, the car, and the final location. They needed the bridge. The bridge did not appear in the public record. And without it, the case stayed open. This is not the same as saying investigators knew nothing. They knew a great deal. They knew Dorothy's movements that evening. They knew the car's path, at least in part. They knew the caller's importance. They knew the later discovery location. They knew the emotional and investigative weight of the calls to Jacob and Vera Scott. But knowing many things is not the same as proving the one thing that matters most. Who was he? That question sits at the center of the file like an empty chair. Everything else seems arranged around it. Sure, the work meeting, the hospital errand, the parking lot, the passing car, the alley in Santa Ana, the telephone, the dry hills, the family waiting. Each part has its place. but the person who joined those places together remains unnamed. In later years, when Dorothy's story was retold, people often returned to the same feeling. The case seems almost close enough to solve. That feeling comes from the caller. A silent case can feel distant. A case with a voice feels near. It feels as if the answer once entered the room, spoke for a moment, and left. But nearness can be misleading. A voice can make a person feel present without making him identifiable. That is the central frustration here. The caller was not an absence. He was a presence without a location. He shaped the investigation, but he did not let the investigation shape him. He offered fragments, but not enough of himself. For Dorothy's family, the unresolved nature of the case meant that grief never had the full boundary an answer can give. They knew Dorothy had been found. They did not know, in a proven public way, who had taken her from them. That kind of uncertainty can last beyond the first generation. It can pass into family memory. A son grows up with a story no child should have to carry. A family keeps a name alive, while the public remembers the mystery. The difference between those two things matters. For the public, the case may be a question. For the family, it was a life. Dorothy was 32 years old. She was a mother. She was a daughter to Jacob and Vera. She was a co-worker who helped when someone needed medical care. She was a woman who tried to live carefully under the pressure of frightening calls. Those facts should remain at the front of any retelling. Shh. The mystery is not valuable because it is strange. It matters because Dorothy mattered, and because the people who loved her were left waiting for an answer that never fully came. Cold case work is often described through breakthroughs. A match is made, a file is reopened, a name is announced. But many cold cases do not reach that moment. They remain in the quieter category of patient incompletion. They are reviewed, they are discussed, they are preserved. Investigators do not force a conclusion simply because time has passed. They hold the line between hope and proof. Dorothy's case belongs there. It is a case of strong patterns and missing anchors. It shows how an investigation can have direction, yet still lack the final connection. It shows how early technology shaped what could be captured. It shows how fire, time, and brief contact can narrow the paths available to police. It also shows the endurance of families. Jacob and Vera Scott answered phones no parent should have had to answer. They carried Dorothy's name forward. They gave the investigation what they could. Their patience was not passive. It was the kind of patience forced on people by unanswered loss. The detectives, too, had to practice a different kind of patience. They had to listen without overreaching. They had to suspect without proving too soon. They had to return to the same facts, knowing the same gaps would be waiting. That is a hard way to work. It can feel like walking a road whose end is always just beyond the next turn. Yet the walking still matters, because sometimes an old case changes after years of no movement. A person speaks. A record is found. A preserved item becomes testable. A name once written in the margin suddenly deserves to be read aloud again. In Dorothy's case, if an answer ever comes, it may come from something small. An old memory, an old call, an old connection between a man, a workplace, and a road in Anaheim Hills. It may come from someone who once heard a detail and did not understand its weight. It may come from a family member of the caller recognizing a pattern too late. Or it may never come. That is a possibility every honest cold case retelling has to allow, not because the case is unworthy of effort, because truth sometimes remains hidden despite effort. The file can be complete in some places and silent in others. That silence is not a cliffhanger. It is part of the record. It is the shape of what investigators could not yet prove. If you sit with the Dorothy Jane Scott case at the end of a long night, the elements settle into a clear order. There were warnings. There was a hospital errand. There was a car that did not stop. There was a burned vehicle in Santa Ana. There were calls that came and went too quickly. There was a discovery near Santa Ana Canyon Road 4 years later. There was identification and there was sorrow. And still there was no named caller. That is why the case went cold. Not because no one cared. Not because there were no clues. But because the clues stopped short of the person. The phone gave a voice, but not a location. The car gave a route, but not a driver. The hillside gave Dorothy back to her family, but not the person responsible. And time carried away what might once have been seen. So the case remains open in the way some old mysteries remain open. Not loud, not moving quickly, just present. Waiting in the records of Orange County, waiting in the memory of a late May night, waiting in the space between a ringing phone and a name never spoken. You can close the file for now. Not forever, just for tonight. The questions will still be there. The timeline will still be there. Dorothy's name will still be there. And somewhere inside the quiet of the case, the missing voice remains the central absence. The one person who knew how to call and not be found.